It was rough. Musicians union was there, but they weren't of much help at the time. I was never happy. I guess what drives me to tear things apart.
For decades, Eddie Van Halen was known as one of the most innovative guitarists to ever walk the earth. A man whose lightning-fast solos and wild stage energy transformed rock music forever. Fans worshipped his sound, critics called him a genius, and other guitarists could only dream of keeping up. But behind that charming grin and easy confidence was a fire, a competitive spirit that burned hotter than anyone ever realized. In interviews, Eddie was known to stay diplomatic. He rarely said anything bad about his peers, but as he got older, and the years of fame, pressure, and creative battles began to take their toll, he finally started opening up. And when he didn't hold back. In a series of conversations near the end of his career, Eddie Van Halen revealed something no one expected, a list of 6 legendary guitarists he could never stand. Not because they weren't talented, but because of ego, betrayal, or the constant comparisons that haunted him throughout his life. Some of the names on that list will shock you. Household legends. Friends turned rivals, and even musicians who once called Eddie their hero. But in Eddie's eyes, they were the ones who crossed the line, who disrespected his craft, copied his style, or tried to take credit for what he created. For a man who changed the sound of rock forever, Eddie Van Halen carried more grudges than fans ever knew. And today, we're diving deep into that untold story. The rivalries, the jealousy, and the truth behind the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen truly hated the most. Eddie Van Halen's rise to fame wasn't smooth, it was explosive. From the first moment he tapped his fingers across the fretboard in ways no one had ever seen before, the guitar world was divided. Half were inspired, and the other half were jealous. By the late 1970s, Van Halen was one of the biggest rock bands in America. But with fame came rivalry. Eddie's talent was undeniable, and it didn't take long for other guitar legends to feel threatened. Behind the scenes, tensions grew between him and a few of rock's biggest names. One of the first rivalries that defined Eddie's early career was with Ted Nugent. The two met backstage at a festival in the late 70s. Eddie idolized guitar innovation, but Ted, known for his loud opinions and even louder guitar tone, didn't take kindly to being overshadowed by a young upstart. Eddie later recalled the meeting, laughing but clearly irritated. "He picked up my guitar and couldn't get a sound out of it," Eddie said. He thought it was broken. The truth was simple. Ted couldn't replicate Eddie's unique sound. Instead of admitting it, Nugent reportedly called Eddie's playing weird and too processed. From that day, Eddie had no respect left for him. "He acted like I was doing some kind of trick," Eddie once said. It wasn't a trick. It was me, but Nugent wasn't the only one. Eddie's innovative style, especially his tapping technique, sparked jealousy across the rock world. Some accused him of stealing the idea. Others said he ruined real rock with too much flash. It infuriated him. Eddie was obsessed with pushing the limits of sound. He modified his own guitars, built custom amps, and broke every rule to create something new. But not everyone understood that passion. As he told one interviewer years later, "Some guys just play guitar. I live it." There's a difference. Around this time, Eddie's name began to surface alongside another rising guitar hero, Randy Rhoads. Fans and critics constantly compared them. Both were young, gifted, and redefining what guitar could be. But privately, Eddie hated the comparisons. He admired Randy's skill, but he couldn't stand being put side by side with anyone. "I don't compete with other players," Eddie once said. "But people keep trying to make it a race. That's not what music is about." Still, the constant media comparisons dug under his skin. Rumor has it that after seeing one headline calling Rhoads the next Eddie Van Halen, Eddie smashed a magazine on the studio floor and walked out. "Next Eddie Van Halen? There's only one," he reportedly snapped. These rivalries became fuel for his fire. Every time someone doubted him, he'd come back with a new riff, a new sound, something no one else could touch. And that's what made Eddie Van Halen both loved and feared in the music industry. His genius was untouchable, and he knew it. But the competitiveness that drove him also created enemies. Many fellow musicians saw him as arrogant or hard to work with, but those close to Eddie said it wasn't arrogance. It was obsession. He just couldn't stand laziness, one bandmate said. If you weren't giving your all, he lost respect for you instantly. By the early 80s, Eddie Van Halen had changed the guitar world forever. But the tension, jealousy, and behind-the-scenes fights were only beginning. And as the years went on, the list of musicians who crossed him and earned his lifelong hatred and would grow. One of them was a guitarist whose name still stings when fans hear it. A man Eddie once called technically brilliant but soulless. That feud became one of the most bitter rivalries in rock history. If there was one guitarist who could bring out Eddie Van Halen's fury like no other, it was Yngwie Malmsteen. Both men were virtuosic in their own ways. Eddie was the rebel innovator who redefined rock guitar, while Yngwie was the classically trained perfectionist who turned shredding into an art form. On paper, they should have respected each other. In reality, they couldn't stand to even be in the same sentence. The tension started in the mid-1980s, when guitar magazines began hyping up Yngwie as the new king of speed. Reporters loved comparing the two, calling Yngwie the next evolution of Eddie Van Halen. To Eddie, that was an insult. He didn't see himself as part of a race. He saw himself as an artist who had built something unique, a sound no one could duplicate. When asked about Yngwie in an interview, Eddie famously smirked and said, "If you play 1,000,000 notes a second but say nothing, what's the point?" It was a subtle jab, but fans caught it instantly. Yngwie, never one to back down, shot back in another interview, "I don't need a gimmick to play guitar." That word, gimmick, hit Eddie hard. To him, there was nothing gimmicky about what he did. His two-handed tapping technique, his amp modifications, his tone, they were all born out of pure experimentation, not trickery. Friends say that from then on, Eddie refused to even mention Yngwie's name. He just didn't respect arrogance, one insider revealed. He thought Yngwie was all flash and no feeling, but Eddie's resentment didn't stop there. He also had deep frustration toward Joe Satriani, another virtuoso who rose to fame in the late 80s. While Eddie respected Joe's skill, he quietly despised how critics started labeling Satriani as the thinking man's guitarist. It wasn't jealousy, it was about principles. Eddie believed music should make you feel something, not impress you with scales. "If you want to think, read a book," he once joked during a sound check. "If you want to feel alive, play loud." Still, fans could sense the tension whenever Eddie was asked about his peers. His answers were always polite but sharp, the kind of remarks that said more between the lines than in the words themselves. Behind closed doors, Eddie reportedly told friends that he couldn't stand how so many guitarists, after him, started chasing technique instead of soul. He hated that his influence had been misunderstood, that instead of inspiring musicians to be original, it inspired a generation of imitators. "Everyone started tapping," he once said, "but no one asked why I did it. I wasn't trying to show off. I was trying to make sounds I'd never heard before." That passion for originality was what separated Eddie from the rest, and also what isolated him. The guitarists he clashed with most weren't his enemies in the traditional sense. They were reflections of what he refused to become, mechanical, soulless, and obsessed with being the best. In truth, Eddie's hatred came from disappointment. He loved the guitar so deeply that he couldn't stand seeing it treated like a competition. To him, music was art, not a sport. And yet, there were still names that stung him personally. Not just professional rivals, but people he once admired, even considered friends, until betrayal and ego tore them apart. As Eddie grew older, his grudges became more personal. Fame had brought him wealth and glory, but it had also exposed him to jealousy, imitation, and manipulation. And among the 6 names on his hate list, 2 of them were shockingly close to home. One was a guitarist who betrayed his trust, and the other, a bandmate who crossed the line. Eddie swore he'd never forgive. That story would become one of the most talked-about feuds in rock history, a feud that nearly destroyed Van Halen itself. For all his brilliance on stage, Eddie Van Halen's deepest wounds didn't come from rival musicians outside the band. They came from within Van Halen itself. Behind the curtain, where the lights faded and the music stopped, there were years of tension, jealousy, and betrayal that would eventually tear the band apart. At the center of it all was Eddie's relationship with Sammy Hagar and, later, David Lee Roth, two men who helped shape Van Halen's success, and two people Eddie came to resent in very different ways. When Van Halen first exploded onto the scene in the late 1970s, Eddie and David Lee Roth were unstoppable, a perfect mix of raw talent and wild charisma. But as their fame skyrocketed, their egos clashed. Eddie wanted to push boundaries musically, while Roth cared more about image, showmanship, and stardom. David was always about being the star, Eddie said in a rare late interview. He wanted attention. I wanted music. The tension between the two grew so toxic that even bandmates started taking sides. Roth mocked Eddie's seriousness, calling him a scientist in a rock band, while Eddie saw Roth as all talk and no discipline. It wasn't long before their creative partnership collapsed. When Roth left the band in 1985, Eddie didn't mince words in private. He told friends he'd never work with him again, calling him a clown pretending to be a frontman. But Eddie's bitterness only deepened with Sammy Hagar, who replaced Roth and ushered in a new chapter for the band. For a while, things were perfect. The albums went multi-platinum, the tours sold out, and the band seemed unstoppable again. But behind closed doors, ego battles returned. Only this time, they cut even deeper. Hagar and Eddie started as friends, bonding over their shared passion for music. But as time went on, creative control became a war. Eddie wanted to experiment. Sammy wanted to play it safe. Arguments over songwriting credits, sound direction, and stage time became routine. Then came the moment that changed everything. During the recording of Balance in 1995, tensions hit their breaking point. Eddie accused Hagar of phoning in his vocals and caring more about his solo career than the band. Sammy fired back, calling Eddie a control freak. Years later, Eddie admitted that what hurt him most wasn't the arguments. It was the betrayal. "I thought he was my friend," he said. "But in this business, friendship only lasts as long as the spotlight does." When Hagar left Van Halen in 1996, Eddie was left bitter and exhausted. For the first time, he began to question whether the band he'd built from scratch had turned into something he no longer recognized. "It stopped being about music," he confessed. "It became about money, power, and ego. I hated it." Even after short-lived reunions with both Roth and Hagar, Eddie's feelings never fully healed. He respected their talent, but he couldn't forgive the disrespect, the manipulation, and the way the media painted him as the villain. "People think I'm difficult," he once said. "But when you care about something as much as I do, you fight for it." I wasn't fighting them. I was fighting for the music. Eddie's inner circle revealed that even years later, he still spoke about those days with frustration. He had poured his soul into Van Halen, only to watch it become a battlefield of broken trust. By the time he turned 62, Eddie had made peace with most of his rivals. But when it came to the betrayals inside his own band, the wounds never fully healed. "They'll say we were brothers," Eddie once remarked bitterly, "but brothers don't stab each other in the back." Yet, through it all, Eddie's playing never lost its fire. If anything, the pain fueled it. Every note he played after those feuds carried that raw emotion, a mix of anger, heartbreak, and defiance that reminded the world why no one could ever replace him. And as Eddie reflected on his life near the end, there were still two names left on his list, two guitarists who symbolized everything he stood against. And his final words about them? Brutally honest. As Eddie Van Halen grew older, he began to reflect, not just on fame and fortune, but on the people who had shaped, challenged, and even hurt him along the way. The world saw a guitar legend, but behind closed doors, Eddie was a man who had seen the best and worst of the music industry. Fame had given him everything, and taken just as much away. When close friends and interviewers asked him in his final years if there were any musicians he truly disliked, Eddie didn't hesitate. He smiled faintly and said, 6 of them, and every one of them taught me something, even if it was what not to become. And then he began to name them. The first was Yngwie Malmsteen, the Swedish guitar virtuoso whose ego often filled more space than his solos. Eddie respected Yngwie's skill, but he couldn't stand his arrogance. "He thinks he invented shredding," Eddie once scoffed. "He forgets who was doing it before he even picked up a guitar." Behind the scenes, there were rumors of Yngwie mocking Eddie's simple tapping style, and that insult stayed with him for years. Next came Ted Nugent. Their clash was legendary. Eddie once said Nugent was all talk, no tone. During a backstage jam in the early 80s, Nugent reportedly tried to critique Eddie's rig setup. Eddie walked out, later telling a friend, "You can't take advice from someone who plays like he's chopping wood." Then there was Joe Satriani, whose technical perfection Eddie admired, but whose emotion he found missing. "He's a machine," Eddie said quietly in one interview. "Flawless, but soulless." It wasn't hatred in the traditional sense, but frustration. Eddie believed music had to bleed, not just impress. The fourth name on his list shocked even his closest friends, Eric Clapton. For years, Eddie idolized Clapton, but after meeting him in person, that admiration vanished. Clapton, by most accounts, brushed Eddie off, treating him like just another fan. "He looked right through me," Eddie said. "That hurt, but it taught me never to forget where I came from." The fifth was a longtime rival, Ritchie Blackmore of Deep Purple. The two had an unspoken feud that stretched across decades. Blackmore dismissed Eddie's style as tricks, while Eddie saw Ritchie as bitter and jealous. "He could never admit someone younger came along and changed the game," Eddie once said with a grin. And finally, the sixth name, perhaps the most surprising of all, was David Lee Roth. Though not a guitarist, Roth had been Eddie's creative partner, his brother in arms, and his greatest enemy. The betrayal, the tension, the manipulation, it all haunted Eddie to the end. "Dave cared about being a star," he once sighed. "I cared about the music. That's the difference between us." But as harsh as those names sound, Eddie didn't reveal them out of bitterness. He revealed them out of honesty. In his final years, he wanted people to know that even legends struggle with pride, ego, and disappointment. In one of his last recorded conversations, Eddie reflected on the list. His voice was softer now, but still carried that trademark spark. "I don't hate them anymore. I hated what they stood for." Music isn't about showing off. It's about soul. If you don't play from the heart, you're just noise. Those words defined Eddie Van Halen more than any solo ever could. He wasn't perfect, but he was real. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing sound. And that's why, even today, when you hear those iconic riffs from Eruption, you can still feel his soul pouring through every note. By the time he passed away, Eddie had made peace with most of his rivals. Some sent messages, others stayed silent. But all of them, every single one, knew they were standing in the shadow of a man who changed rock forever. In the end, Eddie Van Halen's legacy wasn't about who he hated. It was about what he created. He turned anger into art, pain into sound, and rivalry into revolution. His guitar didn't just make noise. It spoke. And for millions of fans around the world, that voice, Eddie's voice, will never fade away.